You know, with this game, Ben Brode really took it on and gave it a similar feel, in my opinion, to Hearthstone, right? Which is real nice. Real nice to get that Hearthstone vibe, right? To take something that feels simple and make it complex, and then you go, damn, I have the biggest brain, and I'm so smart, and nobody else has ever thought of this. Obviously, I have a biased opinion on my initial impression, but I'm excited to get into the basics of cards with you. So let's take a look at our collection here. I'm going to start with the simplest kind of style, which is some of those cards that I think that there's not a lot to explain to them because they don't have an ability. So they're just a raw stat value equation, right? You just got to figure out if what they have as far as power is worth that cost. If you don't know, I'm going to do another video kind of talking about the basics of gameplay, but you play those mini games of war in the zones, right? So it's basically I set my cards down on my side, you set your cards down on your side. I want the most power in that section. That's how I win that zone, and progressively that's how I win the game every time. So without further ado, a good example of this, a real simple card, is somebody like Shocker here. So Shocker has no ability, just a line of text. I'm gonna blast you. What the hell do you mean by that, Shocker? Is that why they call you Shocker? Is that why they call you Shocker? Nonetheless, super cool artwork on this card, by the way, but we'll talk about that in another video. So sweet and simple, you only have two things that you have to pay attention to on a card, right? You want to look at the cost and you want to look at the power. Again, very, very simple layout with a lot of complexity available to it. What parts of cards are important and what decides if I want to use a card? Well, I'm going to give you some insider tips here at Apex Entertainment. In my opinion, just a very general layout to go off of. You usually want the cost to be about 1 for every 2 power. That just gives you a very general idea. If you're just trying to get a raw stats play and know if you're getting good value out of a card, that'll give you a quick idea. So Shocker, in my opinion, is a terrible card. In fact, I think he's the worst card in the entire game currently. He has a 1.5 ratio value, right? 2 cost to 3 power, in addition to having no ability. Now there are certain zones that will give you extra stats or abilities if you have no ability. So in that case, right, it's a rare circumstance where he'd have a lot more value available to him. But nonetheless, I think he's a pretty bad card. Very good example of a basic card though. No ability, just raw stats to look off of. So when it comes to stats, let's talk about each of them individually. The cost itself is very, very important because it's how the game curves as you progress, right? So just like another game that you folks might play that we're not going to state by name, okay? But it rhymes with Barthstone. Similar to that, you have that curve as you go throughout that game, right? So you want to make sure that you don't just flood your deck with a bunch of 6-cost cards, because in the beginning of the game, you're going to have a really hard time trying to snowball or trying to build value early and progress into the late game. And then vice versa, right? If you have just a bunch of small cards, then you may be stuck in the late game with no overthrow potential, right? Nothing big that can really change the game for you at the end. You just fill your board with lots of crap. You do have 12 cards in deck. So if you have 12 1-cost cards, you could play all of them, right? But you're going to have a lot of crappy cards on the board. So you want to be able to build the most value you can. So now that we've talked a little bit about energy, let's talk about power, right? Power is variable. There's lots that can happen with power. So it's important that you keep in mind that power changes all the time, right? So you build as much value as you can with the base card, but you have zones and abilities that will affect power in lots of different ways. So there's not much to say about it. As you can imagine, like I said earlier, you want to make sure you have high power for the value of the card. But you got to keep in mind too that power is variable, and so it makes certain cards really important if they can scale their power quickly, or they can negate, or I should say, detract from the power of opposite cards. Talking big brain here, okay? Strategy, strategy, strategy. So now that we've got a basic idea as far as the importance of different stats like power and cost, I want to talk a little bit about abilities. And as you can imagine, abilities are a really, really, really important part of this game and add lots of variable to it, right? Between abilities themselves and of course zone abilities, that's what adds the spice, right? A little bit of spice to it, and we love some spice here at Apex Entertainment. So I want to give you an example of 3 different kinds of abilities, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how abilities can be compatible with each other and the importance of understanding that as you build out your deck. So the first ability I want to talk about is the ongoing ability. The ongoing ability you may know as a passive ability for some of you big brainers out there that know the lingo, right? You're ahead of the curve. Passive abilities that affect these cards, right? So in this case, Ant-Man has an ongoing ability of if you have 3 other cards here, plus 3 power. So initially, of course, I'm sure you already know by looking at it, but he doesn't have great value if you can't make use of that ability. But then if he does get the ability, he goes far and away ahead of the curve as far as other 1-cost cards, right? A 1/4 is great value. So he's a card that I go back and forth on how I feel about Ant-Man, right? You have to think about the chances of something going wrong, right? Of another card being destroyed in your zone, of movement happening in your zones, and all of a sudden you lose his ongoing ability. But overall, I do think he's a pretty cool card because you control that ongoing effect or that prerequisite to get that ability. So when you can control that yourself to some degree, right? I feel like it's a much higher chance that you'll get the full value out of it in comparison to if your opponent controls that, which some cards will have effects based on where your opponent plays things, and those I think are bad. Next ability that I want to talk about, equally important, is the on reveal ability, or don't you dare call it a battle cry, okay? Don't say it, all right? It's not a battle cry, it's on reveal. It's much better. 2 words? Is battle cry 2 words? Shit. Well, regardless, on reveal, it's basically a battle cry. It destroys a random enemy 1-cost card at this location. As you can imagine, removal in a game like this, when you have a limited amount of cards on the board and limited options as far as properly using your energy, removal is going to be very strong, and I think it's no surprise that there's not a lot of removal in the game currently. Elektra's one of the few, and she can only remove 1-cost cards. But as you can assume, this is a perfect example of a card where that ability really plays the largest part in the value of this card, right? Because a 1/1 is not a good rate at all. But if she can be a 1/1, plus she can destroy a 1/4 Ant-Man sitting in the opposite side, right? Then all of a sudden her value scales massively. I think Elektra's a great card, and again, I think removal is going to be a big focus in the meta of this game, amongst many other things. Of course, I'm going to have other videos where I talk a lot more in depth about strategies, about building some bitch-ass decks with big brain plays. That's what we do here. We grind, okay? We grind the plays. The big brain ones, of course, without saying big brain, always. Big brain. On reveal abilities, the battle cries that have an initial effect. There are lots of different ways that this can play out. These can be doubled, these can be adjusted from other characters. You have cards like Odin is a good example of a card that plays very well with on reveal abilities, but he will be spotlighted later. For now, let's move on to the next ability. So the third and final ability I want to talk about is my etc. category, right? It's kind of a cop-out, I know. That's because there's lots of other abilities that are not on reveal or ongoing abilities. They're abilities with certain prerequisites that may or may not occur. So I have a really good example of this, which is Angel. Angel is such a cool card in my opinion, and he's a great way for me to transition into talking about how to create a complex deck and how cards can work well with each other. And I'm going to talk about how he coincides so well with Carnage and was a big part in one of my favorite decks thus far, which I will of course spotlight in another video. Angel, the way that he works, and just like Barthstone, just like in Barthstone, you have to really pay attention to the writing on the card, or the wording of the card, I should say. So, Angel, when one of your cards is destroyed, this flies out of your deck to replace it. Keyword being deck, right? So, Angel is a good example of a card that there's some fun RNG play to it, which I think Ben Brode and Second Dinner did a great job of giving you that RNG push, of getting you excited, right, for what may or may not happen if something goes a certain way for you. And Angel's one of those cards that plays into that a little bit because he doesn't do anything if he's sitting in your hand. If he's sitting in your hand, he's just a 1-cost 2 power, which is not bad, actually. I thought it was really cool that they didn't make him a 1/1 or something stupid, because then whatever he's replacing that's been destroyed, he's really not building any value from it. When in comparison, if like a 1/1 card gets destroyed, not only is that replaced, but also additional value is added. But he has to be in your deck. So a good example of what this might look like is if you are also using my boy Carnage, which is like my absolute favorite card right now. My God, look at that. Such a badass card. But we'll talk about artwork in another video.